Everyone, welcome to Acupressure Wednesday. I'm Alexa Hulsey from Encircle Acupuncture in Nashville, and thanks so much for joining us. We have a guest joining us today, so we will get him on here in a minute. We're going to be joined by Jeffrey Schifanelli of Savannah Community Acupuncture in Savannah, Georgia, and I'm going to get him on here now. Oh wait, how do I do that? Here we go. Thanks, Jeffrey. There we go. Jeffrey should be joining us at any moment now. There you are. Hey, Jeffrey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
So good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Right
So Jeffrey and I both attended Yosan University in Los Angeles, California. That's how we first met. And now we're both back home in the South practicing acupuncture. So Jeffrey is the owner and acupuncturist at Savannah Community Acupuncture in Savannah, Georgia. So you're just not that far from Nashville. It's great to have you join us today. Thanks for being here.
Right on.
Yeah. So today, Jeffrey's going to be talking about the virtues and the emotions. Really interesting topic, and he's written a great article about that, which we will link to as well because it's really fascinating stuff. And your article is all about finding your center and using traditional Chinese medicine to help with anxiety. So tell me, what inspired you to write this and explore this topic?
Well, as you know, we have the classics in Chinese medicine. So like the Neijing, the inner classic, which is kind of like, for those who don't know, it's like Chinese medicine Bible. That's like the first book that really compiled a lot of our practices. And one of the things that the inner classic really stresses is our longevity practices, our ability to have certain tools that we can use to increase our health, increase our longevity, and how those are the most treasured things in our medicine. Because the more we know about them, the more that we can live life in a certain balance. It isn't about necessarily like avoiding certain things, but learning how to adjust how we behave and also how we see things based on how things change over time. So this idea of the emotions and the virtues came up a lot because when I was learning it in school, I kind of had a very cursory understanding of it. You might remember we had that chart, that 5-element chart.
Yes.
And it was very arbitrary and it didn't make much sense to me. But the classics like the Neijing have a tendency to kind of bring it together. And when you understand all that different dimensions, it brings it to life and you understand how to practice the medicine even better, not only from a clinical standpoint, but also as a patient, you can start to take these tools and apply them to your life.
Yes. And I love how in our medicine, there is an emphasis on longevity, but it's not just living long, it's living well and feeling healthy, at any age. So right. I love that emphasis.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
go ahead.
In the end, it's, because we don't know how long we're going to be on this planet. So quality of life is probably the most immediate and important thing that we can strive for.
Absolutely.
And I think what the emotions and virtues do, as we'll get into it with the spleen in particular, is they show us how to sort of navigate circumstances that are beyond our control and have tools that we can use so that our mind stays more calm while we're dealing with them.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned navigating circumstances beyond our control. And just to put it into a little context, I mean, this whole year has been circumstances beyond our control. Today, for those of you who are watching live, today, Wednesday, March 3rd, is the 1-year anniversary of a terrible tornado that we had in Middle Tennessee last year. It caused a lot of devastation. And so a lot of people in our community are just remembering that and still dealing with the with the effects of that. And so that's certainly a circumstance beyond our control. And I'm looking forward to diving into this topic more. So let's talk about the spleen, because you talk about that a lot in your article, the spleen and the earth element. So what's the significance there?
Okay, so first of all, for those of you who don't know like how the emotions are arranged in Chinese medicine, unlike in Western medicine, where all of our emotions are pretty much like in our brain, executive function of our brain, our personality. In Chinese medicine, the emotions are scattered throughout the body and assigned to different organs. So, and even Western medicine is starting to figure out that it's like the gut-brain connection, and the whole idea that our sense of well-being isn't necessarily just solely coming from the neurotransmitters created in our brain, but that our gut plays a role with it. So for 2,000 years, Chinese medicine had an idea that this was the case. So they assigned each emotion to a specific organ. So in the case of the spleen, which the full name of the spleen is the spleen pancreas official. So, and why that's important to know is because one of the functions of the spleen in Chinese medicine has a lot to do with pancreatic function, which is the absorption of nutrients. So if you hear us refer to it as a spleen, we do know as practitioners the difference between spleen and pancreas from a Western standpoint. But in Chinese medicine, they saw those two organs together as one unit. So both the spleen's functions and the pancreas functions, as we know them in Western medicine, were combined into one, which we call the spleen for short.
Yes.
So the spleen's functions particularly are digestion. So absorption of nutrients, transforming what the stomach breaks down and to create energy that can be used by the other organs. So it's the seat of digestion, but also there's a spirit associated with that organ, which we call the mind or yi. And this is the type of mind that's the thinking mind, it's the ruminating mind. So each organ not only has a emotion, but it has a spirit, which is basically like a part of our psycho-emotional psyche. So, and in the case of the spleen, that's the mind and the ability to process thoughts, to digest what's going on and to assimilate. So the spleen not only works on just the physical aspect of digestion, but also works on our psycho-emotional aspect to break down thoughts so that we can process them and eventually let them go.
Yes. And
So,
I think it's so interesting that the spleen is all about digesting and processing, whether it's the food that we eat or the thoughts that we generate or the stimulus that we take in from the outside and turn it into a thought. The spleen is constantly just processing and digesting. It's a hugely important job for the body and for the emotional mental function.
exactly. And it's the center of our body, which we'll get into a little bit about the positions. Each organ has a direction that's associated with it. So like liver's east and heart is south. And when I was learning these in school, they didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I had no idea. It was just arbitrary stuff. But now when we learn that stuff and we go over in the classics, it adds a new layer to you. You understand why this is. And in the case of the spleen, the direction is center, which is a weird direction. But what that represents is just like the earth, which is the element that's associated with the spleen. The spleen is the center of digestion, which the other organs orbit around, and they require the energy that's created by the spleen in order to function. So literally like the spleen is the earth, and it creates an abundance that the other organs can rely on.
Mm-hmm. And it's our I wonder how you think of this in relation to our emotions, because I hear from patients sometimes who say, I just want to feel more centered. I don't feel like I'm centered. I feel like I'm being pulled in all different directions. So how do you see that kind of feeling of being uncentered related to the spleen?
Sure. So, and that's a very common complaint. Usually, some of these patients will come in and they'll feel a knot in their stomach.
Literally, yes.
So, what's happening here in this particular context, as far as when someone's feeling ungrounded this way, is the emotion that's associated with the spleen is worry, which is the basis of our topic today. And what happens is each of the organs have the way their chi moves is different. So, and chi means function for us. So the way each organ functions is different. And what an emotion will do if it's left unchecked is it will disrupt the function of that organ, and it will disrupt it in a very specific way. So in the case of worry, what it does to the spleen chi is it knots it. And a person will experience that not only psychologically, but they'll experience it physiologically. So, like, they may come in with symptoms of, once again, like a knot in their stomach, bloating, poor appetite. They may have IBS type symptoms as well. And that's because the spleen's chi is not moving appropriately, because worry, in some cases, will knot the spleen chi and it won't allow it to function correctly. So people can viscerally feel it as well as psychologically.
Yes. And I'll give you a real world example of worry affecting the spleen. Last year, after we'd had our tornado and then the pandemic was becoming more widespread here, and I was so worried about how all of that was going to affect my clinic, my patients, my coworkers, and just constant worry, constantly ruminating and trying to figure out different scenarios. I was so worried that I literally worried myself sick, and I ended up my spleen chi became so knotted that it led to what we call rebellious chi, which is when the chi flows in the wrong direction. And I had severe case of nausea and vomiting for a couple of days because that worry had literally made me sick. And so it's an example of how the emotions can cause physical symptoms.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example, which kind of segues into the word emotion in Chinese. So Chinese language is vastly different than English language or other Romanized languages. They use characters instead of actual words. And one of the fascinating things about that is that one character can have a very complex and profound meaning to it because it can be symbolic or ideographic. So it points to a much wider and complex concept. So in it, sometimes one character in Chinese language, it will take us pages to write in order to even come close to it. So in the case of emotion in the Chinese language, the character has an attribute which suggests that emotions should be carefully checked. In other words, not necessarily repressed, but that we should be calm and tranquil. And when we have an emotion, we should allow it to process and allow it to go through, but to be very careful with that. And almost part of that attribute means like keep it under wraps. Mm-hmm. So once again, it's not about repressing emotions because we know that's not healthy, but knowing at some point where that emotion becomes not so much part of the process, but then pathological. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a warning encoded in the language itself that emotions are important, but we need to be careful on how we spend them.
Mm-hmm. What kind of advice do you typically have for people who want to do work on that and work more on living their emotions in a more harmonious expression?
Yeah. So, and that's where the virtues come into play.
Yes.
So the virtues are a way of regulating emotions. And I didn't know this when I was in school. It took me many years to figure it out, and then to kind of put it in practical application, I realized it worked. So virtues, let me describe a little bit what I mean by that. They're almost like moral ideals, not necessarily religious, but more of like archetypal moral ideals that we strive for. And I want to emphasize strive, because I'm always a little cautious when I bring up stuff like virtues and stuff, because I feel a little like, okay, I don't want to sound condescending. It's a practice we all work in, and sometimes we're going to fall short of it, and that's okay. But the point of today is to kind of show you a blueprint that we can all work with, so that when we start to see things start to go off balance, we can rely on that virtue as one of our tools in our toolbox to manage worry. So in the case of the spleen, which worry is the emotion, the virtue is trust. Now, for those of you who may have read other Chinese texts, you may have seen it as integrity. Now, once again, that's because there's no one-to-one relationship between Chinese words and translating into English words. But you may see it translated as integrity, faith, fidelity, and trust. Those are the ones I can think of offhand. I like trust because it seems to really encapsulate the entire framework of it, but you'll see that aspects of all those words play into what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the virtue of the spleen.
Yeah, and in your article, you talk about inner trust and outer trust. And I think those are really interesting distinctions.
Yeah. So, and this really only came light to me very recently. I was listening to a podcast from, I wish I remember her name, but she's very big in classical Chinese medicine. And she was discussing outer trust versus inner trust. And what outer trust is that's basically like the integrity aspect of trust. So the idea that we're in a community, we're together. And as a result, we should kind of be very clear about our motives. We should strive to make sure that we follow through on things and that our actions align with our words. And this type of outer trust sort of creates a credit, if I can use that term, with other people. And it does several things. First of all, it has an unburdening effect on the body. So when things are always going to go wrong, always, even regardless of how well practiced we are in Chinese medicine or in its lifestyle practices, things are going to still go wrong. And the point of all this is not to try to fix that. The point of it is to change our relationship with it. So in the case of the unburdening aspect of building that outer trust, what happens is let's say I'm doing something and it just doesn't work out well, or even just blows up in my face. If I did the best I could, I was honest with myself and others, I took other people's welfare into consideration as my own, and I just really put myself out there, that even if things don't work out, I'm not carrying around the baggage of like, well, I didn't handle that right. Or, I didn't, I cut corners here, that kind of thing. It helps you to go to bed with a clear conscience.
Yeah, it's like that integrity piece of it.
And then also, the interesting thing about our trust is it plants seeds for abundance. Much like the earth, what happens is that the more you do these things that are filled with integrity, is not only does your value system change and you're looking more at the process than the end result, but also you start to create other opportunities because people see, oh, okay, this is a person who was easy to work with, they followed through on things, and you're more likely to get other opportunities that will open up, even if the one that you really wanted to kind of didn't work out. So it's like
I love that idea of planting seeds for abundance and how that relates to the earth element. That's and to really to the center as the cardinal direction too. That's really an interesting take on it.
Yeah, so outer trust is it's really important. It helps to unburden our conscience first of all, and we start to actually have a value of system where we're more concerned about how we're behaving during a process and stuff than the end result. I mean, we all want to be happy. We all want material things. I'm not denying that. But when you're experiencing it within the context of the virtues, that grip of materialism starts to lessen a little, and that's not the only thing that you end up measuring the success of the experience you're going through.
Right. So it's a bit of letting go of the outcome and just acting in a way that is in alignment with your values and who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes right into the inner trust aspect.
Yes.
So with the inner trust, it's a lot like faith. And once again, it doesn't necessarily have to have a religious religious reference to it. When we're talking about inner trust, we're talking about that there's something beyond ourselves, that there's some type of grand design that's working towards our evolution. And although our polarized idea of good and bad can sometimes get in the way of things, and this does not operate on that level, this type of intelligence is beyond, our understanding of good and bad. The idea that there's something out there that's giving us a compass, a direction to follow, and that we just need to follow it, and that we will evolve as a result of this. And that creates self-assurance.
Mm-hmm. And then that relates to the center again, of staying centered by having this inner trust or this faith, because there is something else that you can rely on for your compass.
Yep. Yeah, it's about being grounded.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like the spleen, what we were talking about, each of the organs have an element associated, and the spleen is the earth. So imagine the earth manifests this virtue very well. The earth has a lot of integrity. It takes a lot of beating from us. And yet at the same time, it still transforms things into abundance and life so that we can keep on living. And it just seems to keep giving. Now, its patience may be wearing thin lately, but nonetheless, it still does. It does magnificent things every day. And it's the center of our existence. We live on the periphery of the earth, that we live on its circumference. So it's the center of our life. So in a lot of ways, we are the organs that are traveling around the center. And in Chinese medicine, we have the macrocosm and microcosm. So what's happening on a big level is also happening inside of us. And that's why our digestive system and the emotion worry and the virtue, which associated, which is trust, represent that aspect of the earth and the ability to be able to transform food into energy for the organs, but at the same time to digest our thoughts so that our mind is healthy, that we ruminate, not to the point of pathological, because that's what happens to anxiety when it knocks the chi. Then what happens is that we can't process our thoughts completely, and they just keep regurgitating like on a ticker tape.
Mm-hmm. And I think about the food that we eat, and the farther away that our food gets from the earth, then the more denatured our food is, then the more damaging it is to our spleen and pancreas and our earth element. And so the more earthy our food is, the more directly it comes from the earth, less processing, that's going to benefit our earth element internally.
Yep.
Yeah.
And in virtue, speaking of the Chinese character, so once again, we're striving towards these ideals. In the Chinese character for virtue, there's an attribute for cultivation, bringing forth engender. And what it's suggesting is that these virtues are meant, whereas emotions are meant to be kind of carefully managed, the virtue is meant to grow and flourish. And so some of this, from a rational standpoint, it's not going to make sense to someone until they experience it. Because experiential and logic or rational are two different things. And okay, you'll get like the basics of it, but when you start experiencing what I'm talking about, it does change like how our response to things are. And even when the world is just not going our way, it doesn't create rose colored glasses and we go out and do stuff. But I know when I started to embrace some of this, that it opened up space in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It made me calmer.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what kind of practical suggestions do you have for somebody who's maybe struggling with this and wants to feel more centered, wants to cultivate more of that trust, inner trust and outer trust? What do you tell people who are wanting to do that?
Well, I'm a big jump right in type of person. So, because that's really the only way that I've been learning and still will keep on learning is that I put myself in situations that sometimes are just downright uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying put yourself at risk for things, but if some things like I don't know if I want to do that, or something, I just go and do it. And at some point, I'm like, okay, whatever happens, happens. But I'm gonna put my best efforts into it and do the best I can and be present during it and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So some of it's like just a curiosity to actually apply the virtue from an outer standpoint. Inner's a little bit more tricky. Inner trust is very personal. So for some people, it will be religious, and some people, it won't be. And some people will just be just spiritual, and other people who are atheists, they'll have to find their own language for it. But what I've found is just by observing like what's going on and seeing how things shift from yin to yang and how extreme yin can become yang and etc., kind of reinforces the idea that okay, the world is in flux and I need some type of inner compass, because obviously to put all my eggs into the material aspect of the world, which I have no control of, is not working for me. It's
Yeah.
just it makes me miserable. It makes me
Yeah.
worried all the time because it's the only metric system I have.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any favorite acupuncture or acupressure points that you like to use when working on these issues with patients?
Yeah, there's several. Well, first of all, if a person has a knot in their stomach and they have a what we call a wiry pulse. So we check pulses for those of you listening, and if a pulse is wiry, that's usually a sign of stress. So there is a point on the foot in between the second and third digit, really close to the junction of the two bones there. I think we call it the Golden Gate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very good for that type of feeling of stuck there.
Yeah, so if this is my foot,
Uh-huh.
it's kind of right here.
Yeah, you got it. Between the second and third, really deep there to press on that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right before these bones join together on your foot.
mhm.
Yeah.
So that's one. And then an easy one is P6,
Mm-hmm.
pericardium 6. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So right here between these tendons.
mhm.
Um, this I love this point, and it's about the width of your three fingers from the wrist crease. Just feel around and find a tender spot. I love this point because it's great for nausea. I was pressing that on myself a lot when I was sick last year.
So, and then spleen 6. It's probably
Mm-hmm.
like the next one I would think of. And the nice thing about spleen 6 is it has a psycho-emotional aspect to it as well as the physiological things that it treats. So if someone tends to be more towards, let's say, poor appetite, maybe they're more like loose stool, that kind of thing, I'll use like a spleen 6 on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is so interesting. And I'm going to ask you quickly too, because people are probably curious. What kind of dietary suggestions do you give to people who are wanting to work on their center and cultivate trust?
So seasonal foods is what I always suggest. So now we're entering into spring, it's a little bit different than winter, but still eating foods like root vegetables, things that are like butternut squash, sweet potato. Cook your foods as much as possible. Even now that we're entering spring and you can have a little bit more latitude with that, I always encourage patients to cook more of their foods than to eat raw, because a lot of times if a person is already deficient in their spleen, raw foods will tend to slow it down, and the spleen likes warmth. That's how it functions. So even though a salad may seem healthy, if it's the majority of your meal, it will actually slow down your digestion. You may notice you get gassy or feeling distended and that kind of thing. So definitely cooked foods, a lot of root vegetables, um, good quality fats as well, because you need this stuff to burn the energy so that the spleen can make the chi necessary for the organs.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
And
great.
bitter foods tend to counteract sweet. So if you have a sweet tooth, try something bitter.
Yes. Yes. Well, Jeffrey, this has been so interesting. In case, again, you're just joining us, this is Jeffrey Schifanelli of Savannah Community Acupuncture in Savannah, Georgia. And we're going to put a link to his article about finding your center and the emotions and virtues. It's really interesting stuff. So, Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. All right, everyone, have a great day. We'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.